So it's Monday. I think South Africans are still mulling, making sense of President Cyril Ramaphosa's national executive, a much anticipated, long awaited, all of those words, cabinet. We waited for so long. It's actually been 9 days. But in the past, where the ANC had a clear majority at the polls, they would have moved a little bit faster. Yes, he would have consulted because he does that. But it would not have been this extensive. It wouldn't have been the back and forth ball that we watched playing itself out in the lead up to Sunday. That's when he made the address to the nation, announcing members of his cabinet. They said 9 o'clock. The thing about the president and time management, he's become so tardy. I always find it difficult to manage that, considering that when he was elected ANC president in 2017, one of the things he wanted to do was to be a person who keeps time. And he wasn't. Last night, mind you, I was told one of the reasons why he was so late is because we're still calling those he's appointed to cabinet. What's interesting about that, if you saw Gayton McKenzie's tweet about how he's not getting a call, questioning if there's network, some in the DA say they didn't get calls at all about their appointments from their new boss, in essence. So, you need to keep an eye out for the politics there, because that's quite telling. Some said he looked really bitter, like he had a tough time announcing his cabinet. But that's what happens when you don't win elections. You must figure out how to make sense of the consequences. And for the ANC, it is about power sharing. I said there was a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of arguments. Is this called a government of national unity in its truest sense? And it couldn't be. Because when GNU was done in 1994, the ANC enjoyed majority. The ANC was extending the olive branch. This time around, the ANC is not extending anything. The ANC needs help to stay in power. And that's been part of what's made, I think, these negotiations quite difficult for the ANC, is that those who are helping you stay in power are well aware that they're assisting you stay in power. So I think that that's something that the ANC have to manage. In a nutshell, what's come out, we've gone from 28 ministries to 32. He spoke previously about a lean, mean, efficient cabinet. That's clearly not the case. Part of the reason why this has happened, from my understanding, and I think his own words really, is to accommodate the many parties that have signed on to the GNU. And again, you can see it as a GNU. Some people will tell you it's actually a grand coalition dressed up as a GNU. There's actually a way for the ANC and the DA to work together. Hey, the reading is yours. The ANC publicly will make an argument that they opened the door to everybody, and pretty much everyone took, except for Action SA, Umkhonto weSizwe, the EFF, and ATM, if you may. I think those are the kind of the parties that are left out as far as those that are in parliament are concerned. So I'm leaving one or two on the wayside, but that's, in essence, that's about it. But then, yeah, 32 ministries, quite bloated. Not only that, but 11 of those ministries, right, have at least 2 deputy ministers. And I think my very quick criticism around having 2 deputy ministers is it really a question of division of labor? Because the tasks are so great that you need 2 deputy ministers to assist. Remember, deputy ministers aren't cabinet approved. They can't even stand in for one minister if that minister can't do their jobs. Another minister needs to step in. So for me, the appointment of 2 deputy ministers communicates quite a lot about the way a president negotiates. I mean, how far are you willing to go to appease the people who are at the table, that to a point where now you've given us a financial burden, actually, in the form of your government, from where I'm standing. A quick breakdown of that executive. You've got 6 posts in cabinet given to the DA. They also have 6 as deputy ministers. You got 3 to the IFP, 1 to Good, 1 to PA, 1 to PAC, 1 to Algerman, 1 to UDM. I want to make you laugh very quickly about the PA one. If you remember, Gayton McKenzie's been saying for the longest time, we're not in politics for ambience. We want power. He was quite clear that they wanted police, they wanted home affairs. Well, they don't have police or home affairs. And I think some people are quite relieved that Patriotic Alliance is nowhere near the police or home affairs, particularly home affairs, if you know what I mean. Abahambe, so to speak. He's at sports, arts, and culture, and I think he's received it with some relative excitement and grace, actually, posting about how he's ready, about how this will work out. I will not be surprised to see Gayton in Paris next week for the Olympics. I expect to see him already digging deep and working quite hard. UDM is quite interesting. Bantu Mesa, I think everybody knew the minute he signed on to the GNU that it would end up at some department, and we all knew that defense will be linked to it. This is a man who is referred to as a general whose profile pictures are his time in the SANDF, who's quite married to the idea of who he was during that time. So a man who lives in nostalgic times, no surprises there at all. The DA managing really to get very interesting portfolios. They didn't get Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Park Stau of the ANC is in charge of that department, but it's quite interesting to see the DA's taking agriculture, basic education, which is quite exciting because Siwe Kwagube is young. She forms part of a young cohort of ministers. Her and Soli Malatsi from the DA are ministers. Soli takes over communication. I think that's an interesting story. I think it's also something worth celebrating that if you look at the ANC, Nongceba Mhlawuli, Zuko Godlimbi, they are deputy ministers. And then if you look at the IFP, Mkhuleko Hlengwa, who's been in parliament for well over 12 years, he now gets to cut his teeth in government. He'll be serving as a deputy minister to Baba Creasy in transport. I also found that a little bit interesting to look at. My other interesting tidbit, I do think that the ANC has outmaneuvered to some degree some of these parties. So the ANC got 40% at the polls. If proportional representation is the formula that has been used to allocate these portfolios, that should be reflective, and I don't think so. I think if you look at the cabinet that's emerged, the national executive, if you may, the ANC is about 60% on lockdown. So the ANC has done quite well to get an edge in. Another interesting thing to look at about the cabinet announcement has to be seeing the likes of Sihle Zikalala, somebody who I actually respect quite a lot, who I also think is one of the ANC's top ministers, well educated, taking a position of deputy minister, being offered deputy minister. That's really quite hard to process. He becomes Dean McPherson of the DA, as Deputy of Public Works. So not only will he remain in the department he led, but he will be second in command in that particular portfolio. Mondli Gungubele also steps down from being in charge of communications to being the Deputy Minister on Communications. His boss becomes Soli Malatsi. So it'll be interesting to see how those relationships work. And I think the ANC, by and large, where portfolios are given to the opposition, they have made sure they've got their own somewhere in the room to keep an eye, I suppose, on those particular departments and what's happening there. I did speak about the youth representation. I think it is quite interesting, but I do think that you must criticize the ANC, where the ANC's youngest are deputy ministers, the DA's youngest are holding portfolios. They are actual ministers. So I do think that there's something to be said. I also think when you look at the ministers who've been retained, what you're looking at is actually like a cabinet reshuffle. So Ronald Lamola is still there, but he moves from justice to international relations, which I think is actually a good move. It's an interesting one. Senzo Mkhunu moves from water, where he was praised for the work he did at water and sanitation. He moves to police. I'm interested in seeing how that plays out, because Senzo Mkhunu, I don't think, is a character that will try and overshadow operations, i.e. the commissioners and Fani Masemola and the likes. So it'll be interesting to see how those people work together. So I'm also looking quite closely at the DA. What happens to the DA in Parliament? They've done a role of oversight for so long that historically, as they point out, they're now stepping into national government. And I think a part of me has been watching the DA, and the story that stuck out for me is that here's a party that actually has a skills deficit. It's got the cream of the crop. And those are your CVUs, your Solis, your Dion Georges, who will be appointed, for sure, who are being appointed. But there's a question mark around who's next in that layer of leadership, and I can't see it. It's very difficult for me to even pick who will become the chief whip to replace Sivu Kwagube, because there's such a massive gap between the greatness of these people that they put forward versus the next layer of leadership. And I think that they recognize that. If they'd been given more positions, I think the DA would have fallen into crisis. And one will make an argument, but this is a party that speaks about due process, right? So they look for CVs and qualifications and the likes. Well, look at its leaders. Look at its current cohort and offering of ministers, and you make the decision around qualifications. But I do think watch the DA quite closely. There is a gap in skills there, and it's going to show itself quite a lot. And I also think that the DA has functioned based on ego. Federal leader of the DA, of course, I'm talking about John Steenhuisen, and his ego gets bruised and media is punished for it. We've been labeled opponents. He doesn't speak to a fair amount of us. And so I'm also curious as to see how he'll handle himself in government, because see, when you're in government, you don't represent your jacket, you represent South Africans. And you owe it to the rest of us to answer to all of us when we ask you questions. So the maturity that is required to navigate national government will be an interesting one to watch. I'm excited about people like Mkhuleko Hlengwa. They're young, they've been in parliament well over 12 years, I said. It'll be interesting to see what they do in the government space and how well he will work with someone like Barbara Creasy. I was speaking about the ANC a little bit earlier, saying that it's like a cabinet reshuffle, right? People like Ronald have been moved from the one to the other. Senzo Mkhunu moved from the one to the other. I don't understand why Enzi Mutsaga is still a member of cabinet. Like, it's really wild. She's been at basic education since 2009. When the opportunity for her to bow out finally arrives, they resuscitate her at defense. Why? So I have an issue with those kind of decisions, but I also, even Stella, oh my goodness, Stella Ndabeni Abrams. Why does she remain a minister? I said Sihle Zikalala for me is a brilliant person. He's been demoted. He's now deputy minister. Why couldn't you swap? Why? If you look at Stella, she's somebody who's gotten herself into trouble multiple times. So you wonder about the considerations and why people like Stella are rewarded. Why people like Bladen Zemande. Yes, you can make an argument that he's on an SACP ticket. For how long, though? To whose benefit? Those are the questions. I've always said the beauty of having multi-parties serving in cabinet is that they'll be in competition with one another. They'll be forced to put their best feet forward, I hope, and we'll see what that does. The ANC has also appointed Pemi Majodina. She replaces Senzo Mkhunu at water and sanitation. I don't know. I don't even have an opinion on how that will work. It is a big deal. She has been loyal. She comes from being the chief whip of the ANC in parliament. How will she fare in ministry? Only time will tell, I suppose. But I do know that all these parties are at a time where you can't afford to take silly risks. And I think when I look at some in the ANC, there are some silly risks, but there are also phenomenal appointments. Tembi Nkadime into justice makes sense. Pakstau also moving to DTIC makes sense. They've retained Enoch Kondongwana. Gwere Mangtash has been retained, albeit with a different kind of ministry. He's lost the energy component of his ministry. So it's a very interesting mixed results that are very much reflective of the GNU. I'm curious about what happens in Parliament because so much has been taken from Parliament. These parties are no longer opposition. They're the government of the day. So it'll be interesting to see what Umkhonto sees on the EFF and the ATM will do with their role in Parliament. It'll be interesting to see what happens to a Songes or ZB or a Musi Maiman who are now part of this formation in Parliament. Some are hoping that they get committees. It'll be interesting to see what happens to Scopa. There are many interesting avenues around the role of Parliament going forward, and as well as where they will clash around policies, right? So the DA and the ANC don't necessarily share policy, not even don't necessarily, they don't share policy perspectives on many things. Will the DA ministers, like Siwe Kwahube, be implementing the Bella Bill, for instance? What happens to the NHI? Yes, the NHI has the luckiness or is that a word? Has the lack of having ANC ministers there. Aaron Motsoaledi being returned to health, I also have an issue with that. I don't necessarily think he did a great job at health, but he returns to health. Joe Pahla moves from being the minister back to deputy. And what will that tag team deliver? I'm not too sure either. What I think is also interesting is not only the crossover around policies, but there's a ministerial handbook, and there's a village there in Pretoria, and there's blue lights, which many in the ANC over the years have been clamoring for. Some of the opposition parties don't want those things. They've made it very clear that they don't want those perks. And I wonder if, one, they'll stick to not wanting those perks. Two, the impact of ministers who don't want to take more from the taxpayers on an ANC that for years and years and years has been taking so much from the taxpayers. It'll be very interesting to see how they divide and manage those, or even how they'll divide the tasks with the many deputy ministers that have been appointed. I think a part of me feels that Prince Ramaphosa, yes, they call him a great negotiator. I don't know how great a negotiator you are when you're appointing so many deputies because you're trying to accommodate so many people. I think that it's actually an indictment on your negotiation skills. When instead of trying to manage and to deliver the best core, you make the circle bigger to accommodate everyone. But whether this GNU will even hold to a year, let alone 5 years, only time will tell. But me, I'll be here giving you updates.